building castles has basically become a Minecraft staple at this point. If you're here, I know you've been in the survival world and thought, man, I should build a castle. Well, here's some advice if you ever decide to actually finish the thing. For castles, I recommend spending a lot of time on the rough shape. Most of the details in these larger builds will come from the overall shape and not from the individual block textures. When working on the shape for a castle, my main goal is to avoid having an overly blocky shape. You can do this by taking chunks away or adding random cubes to your build. The main goal here is to add variation to your build. You never want to have one section that is too flat. For castles, I usually focus a lot in having variation in the height of the build. I would put more separate high and low points than I would in a build that isn't a castle. A good way to accomplish this is by adding towers. There are several types of towers that you might want to use, but the most common ones are turrets and spires. Spires are the ones with the pointed roof, and I would say that they're the most common ones that you see. Spires are very useful because you can do a lot with the roof, and it can help add a lot of character to your build. The second type of tower is the turrets. These are the ones that look like the rooks from chess. In the castle that I'm building right now, I tend to use a lot of turrets, just because I felt like that it fit the style. Feel free to experiment with your tower designs though, because there definitely aren't only these two. A tower can really be anything in your build that adds the extra height variation that you need. One thing that you'll see a lot of castles have is an outer wall encircling the building. Many castles in real life might have multiple sets of walls to defend the building. So a lot of the time, it'll help to add an exterior wall to your castle, just to give it the more iconic castle look. One problem you might have with these though, is they do tend to cover up the main portion of your build. This is why a lot of the time, you'll see me building them fairly low in comparison to the rest of the build. What you can do though, if you start having this problem, is you can use the terrain to your advantage. You can raise up the main portion of your castle on a hill or something, and have the main walls below. This will make it so that you can see everything from most angles, and make it so that you won't have to remove the walls. For the castle that I'm working on now, I was going for some sort of mix between a Renaissance style and a medieval styled castle. I kept the outer wall fairly low, and I used some turret towers to outline the wall edges. I tried doing something a bit different with the block palette this time. I usually don't do that many gradients with my builds, so this time I tried to do one. Near the bottom, I used darker blocks, like tuff and cobblestone. Then as the castle went higher, I used lighter and lighter blocks like stone and andesite. I decided not to do any sort of gradient on the frames. What I did though is I used a pretty even mixture of stone bricks and andesite. For the roof, I went with a 2-up 1-over design. I didn't want to do anything too shallow because most of the castle roofs will be pretty steep if they have one. I also gave the roof a bit of a dip. This makes it look like gravity is pulling the center of the roof down because it might be a bit less supported there. On each wall, I put a fairly large window for detail. I really like large windows because they fill up a lot of space, and they look pretty nice. They might look complicated, but they are pretty easy to make. I stick with a symmetrical design for these, and sort of just place slabs and stairs wherever looks nice. Most people seem to just assume that in order for it to be a castle, it needs to have the flat turret-styled roof all the way around. But depending on the style that you're going for, you can have many different types of roofs. For example, on a Renaissance-styled castle, you might see a roof that's squared off and sort of goes up to a point. But it's also pretty fun to be creative with this. For example, on the castle I'm doing now, I'm going to use an onion domed roof. I think it fits well with the desert theme, and it's fun to do. What I found though is some people get fairly nitpicky about what a castle actually is. The actual definition of a castle is a large building that is typically from the medieval period that is fortified against attack with thick walls, battlements, or towers. This leaves room for a lot of creativity in your castle designs, so as long as it looks sort of built up for attack, it could be a castle. One of the more difficult parts of doing a castle is portraying the size. Castles need to be big, but that doesn't mean that you always have to be using a lot of blocks in your build. This is because at a certain size, it gets hard to judge scale of builds. This is why it's important to have size references around your build. I like to use details like doors a lot, since they're usually the size of a person. You can also use other things, like trees, paths, and lampposts, or anything else that has a recognizable size. What works really well if you're playing in survival is using your player as a scale. All this means is everything that would be the size of a person, like a door, would just be the standard size of your character. So for a door, you would use a door as size. This is typically the smallest size you can go, because most blocks are around that size. This won't work as well in creative mode though, because most people when viewing your build will be flying around. When you're flying around, you can get sort of confused about what size parts of the build actually are. What I found is the terrain of your build can be very useful for portraying the size. For example, if your castle is surrounded by mountains, and it's relatively the same size, that implies that it's a very big castle. You can also use things like trees. If your build is larger than a tree, then that could help portray a larger size. On this build, I spent a lot of time tinkering around with the details. Around each corner of the build, I put a tower to emphasize the size. I used a good mixture of the turret-style towers and the spire-style towers. What was really fun about this though, is the onion roofs. I spent a lot of time messing around with the shape, although for the spires, I do think the onions are a bit squished. But I think it's fine here though, because it gives them a bit more of a pointy shape. For the block palette on this build, I used a gradient also. On the gradient, for the darker bottom colors, I used some stripped birch and some birch planks. Then as the gradient started moving up, I started using a lot more of the sandstone blocks. Castles are very powerful structures, and when done correctly can add a lot to your world. As long as you keep in mind the overall shape of your castles, and make sure that you keep the scale correct, your castle should look spectacular. I do know that a lot of people don't want to go all out for the terrain like I've done, but I do suggest at least adding a few custom trees around your build. If you don't know how to do that or you want to improve on your own, here's a video I made that could help with that.